I want to just start off by thanking everybody for taking some time out of their day today to join Alex and I for this conversation. I know we're getting ready for a holiday weekend. Those of us on the East Coast are sweating it out a little bit here. But I really appreciate you taking some time out for this conversation, and I hope that it's a fruitful one. So what we'll be discussing today is, do we need a blockchain to be decentralized? And the conversation is with Alex Hillman. First of all, here are some places where you can find me on the internet. I'm hoping that we'll get a chance to maybe have some interaction with the audience. If we don't, by all means, reach out. You can tag me on Twitter, shoot me an email. Love to hear your questions and know what you're thinking in terms of this webinar, hear your feedback. Also, this webinar is kind of part of a new project I have going on called Build Blockchain Tech. So it's basically an initiative to create resources for people who are interested in learning more and kind of going deeper on blockchain technology. So getting past the hype, getting past kind of the narrative that we're used to hearing about cryptocurrency, worrying about the prices and about investment strategies, and instead really trying to understand the technology at a deeper level and coming at it from a technical perspective. So specifically targeting people who are developers, entrepreneurs, builders, people who want to know what this new technology unlocks for them in terms of capabilities for the future. So that is what this project is about. This webinar is a piece of that initiative, and I hope if you find this interesting, you'll check out some of the other stuff that I have on the site, subscribe to the newsletter, that sort of thing. So today's conversation is with Alex Hillman. Alex is a friend of mine, and he's also the co-founder of Indie Hall, where I'm a member. Indie Hall is one of the earliest, longest running, and really one of the most respected co-working communities in the world. I think it's safe to say that Indie Hall really helped to define what co-working is and helped build kind of that initial co-working community. So it's awesome that we have it right here in Philly and that I get to be a part of it. It's a great group of people. And so if you're in the Philly area and need a co-working space, there's lots of different tiers of membership, and I would definitely suggest you check that out. So Alex is, of course, also an entrepreneur. He's a developer, speaker, prolific writer, has a podcast that he hosts. He's just an all-around expert in building community. And so please check out him on Twitter. Please check out his personal blog, dangerouslyawesome.com, which is a great domain name. I'm jealous of that one. And also he and Amy Hoy publish a lot of great resources at stackingthebricks.com for how to kind of step-by-step build your business. Get started with and build up a business and entrepreneurship. So great set of resources, one that I constantly refer to and use in my own endeavors. So Alex attended the first webinar that I hosted for Build Blockchain Tech, and he and I were emailing a bit after that discussion about blockchain and about cryptocurrency, and he kind of expressed a little bit of skepticism around the technology. Nothing too negative, but just he wasn't sure if this was really all that the hype seemed to indicate. And I totally understand that perspective. In fact, a lot of what I'm doing with this project is trying to get past that hype and understand what's really going on. So I really always like to pay attention when smart people like Alex are skeptical of things that I'm maybe enthusiastic about, to try to understand that and unpack that a little bit. And so Alex was nice enough when I asked him to agree to do this webinar with me. So just want to thank Alex again for his time today. And without further ado, we can dive into the conversation. So what I'd like to cover today, that was our introduction. I'd like to really just loosely have a conversation about a few things. First of all, what is decentralization? What do each of us kind of think of that as? And why is decentralization, this concept, important in the first place? Why is this even something that we should or would want? And then finally, I'd like to talk about how does, or maybe doesn't, blockchain and cryptocurrency in general help us get to a more decentralized world. And so this is, again, a loose outline of where I'm hoping to take the conversation with Alex, but we'll see where it goes. Maybe we'll go down a rabbit hole in a different direction. We'll see. And if there is time at the end, I would love to take questions from the audience. But like I said, if there's not, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and continue the discussion later. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and invite Alex on the screen, I hope. All right, as we wait for Alex to get back here.
Good morning.
Hey, Alex, how you doing?
Doing how are you?
Good. Thanks again for agreeing to do this and making the time.
Very, very happy to be here. It's a conversation I've been looking forward to for the last few weeks as we've been planning it.
Awesome. Well, hope you're staying cool with this with the heat today in the Philly area.
Trying. I just got back from Portland where it was a nice 75, maybe max 80 every day, and came back to the sauna of the East Coast.
Oh man, you should have stayed a few more days, I think.
Maybe.
So so let's just we have limited amount of time here, so we can just dive right in. Kind of the first question that I wanted to touch on, because you mentioned in our emails that you are a fan of the idea of decentralization. So just to make sure we're thinking about the same idea and what that really means, what do you consider decentralization, and then we can go into why you think that's important.
Yeah, when I hear the word decentralization, a couple of things come to mind, and a couple of books in particular that like really informed my thinking about my work, my career, about community building. And one of them was a book called The Unified Theory of the Web by David Weinberger. The idea of small pieces loosely joined, and the power of rather than building monolithic ecosystems. A monolithic ecosystem is actually kind of a oxymoron to begin with. And if you think about the way the internet works, from the nature of how it's built, it's lots of little nodes that are connected to one another, but then also connected to others. And the power of no one entity or organization or even technology saying who can and cannot talk is sort of at the ground level of what allows the internet to be the internet and has allowed so many people to create and build things on top of it. The other thing that comes to mind is a book called The Starfish and the Spider, which is I read, I want to say in like 2006 or so, and was a big piece of me understanding what I wanted to do with community building. And the starfish and the spider is sort of a metaphor for two organisms. You take a starfish, actually you take a spider, and if you were to start plucking its legs off one by one, it would slowly become immobilized. Those legs don't grow back. Once you remove all the legs, you're done. But in certain species of starfish, if you cut off a leg, the leg actually grows back. But in certain species of starfish, if you cut off the leg, not only does the leg grow back, but that cut off leg piece can actually grow an entire new starfish.
Wow.
Which is,
know.
Yeah, nature being super weird. But in order for that to be possible, there is literally a decentralized nervous system in the starfish where like the legs operate almost as individual creatures, even though it is one species. And so that's the reason the book is called that. And the book covers a bunch of different examples and metaphors throughout history of organizations and cultures where they're able to compare two different styles, one where there is a centralized leader and one where there is distributed leadership. And in the cases of distributed leadership, these organizations tend to be more enduring. They're more powerful, not necessarily they grow faster, although growth is a component, but there's an endurance component to it. And one of the examples that I think is easiest to sort of to understand is the difference between some like Mayan and Incan Central American tribes where power was very centralized, and therefore it was very easy for the conquistadors to come in and basically wipe them out. Versus other North American tribes where so it was much harder, much slower for the equivalent to come in and wipe them out. Not that they weren't eventually successful, sadly, but there was a communication structures where one sub-tribe could be potentially attacked or under fire, and the other tribes would organize and self-organize. And if there was the need for new leadership to emerge, that was built in as well. And so I've always been fascinated with and kind of enamored by this idea of building into your systems things so that if you rely on one leader, you recognize that you have the that leader is basically a kill shot, right? It's a liability, which means that person can collect power. That person can also be taken out of power by an equivalent or more powerful entity. Create distributed systems where emergent leadership is possible, and where emergent power is gathered and then redistributed. You end up with these much longer enduring, more complex in some ways, but longer enduring systems. So that's what I think about when I think about decentralization, is those ideas. I think about it more in a context of leadership and power than I do necessarily in technology. But there are elements of communication and documentation that are necessary in order for that to be possible as well. So I could see some tie-ins to the conversation we're going to have, but that's where my head goes.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's really good. So I think basically we share a lot of the same kind of ideas and values around decentralization and why it's important. Maybe I would add some additional vocabulary that I think helps to express that. So I look at it as kind of bottom up versus top down, right? So having kind of flat organizational structures where you have lots of different groups that can kind of experiment independently, and kind of the best and most interesting and most robust kind of solutions kind of work their way up permeate their way through the organization, as opposed to someone kind of on high delegating or decreeing some direction or way of doing something. And what I think is interesting about that is that kind of what you're talking about how these distributed organizations can be, in a sense, they might grow slower and they might have less concentrated power, but they're more robust to change or to outright attack, right? And that's because there isn't this kind of centralized authority, centralized point of failure, but also because it allows for kind of this broad range of experimentation. So it's almost like a biological system in that way, right? Like it's evolutionary. So there's lots of kind of tinkering, and the good ideas will survive and spread, and the bad ideas won't. And in fact, when the system changes, when things change, because you have lots of different groups or different people, individuals doing things in different ways, if the rules of the game suddenly change, there's probably someone out there that's able to adapt to it, some part of your organization that can handle it, and those ideas can propagate throughout the kind of the system. I think a lot of times when people think of centralization and decentralization, there's kind of that connotation of power and how power is negative. The assumption being that someone in a position of power is going to abuse that position of power, and certainly we do see lots of examples of that. But I almost look at it as before you even talk about like outright abuse, there's just the difference between people who are kind of on the ground closest to the situations being able to make their own decisions versus people who may have the best of intentions, but by virtue of being separate and further away from those things that are going on the ground are not able to make the best decisions. And that's where I see decentralization is really valuable as well.
And to riff a little bit on your last point there in particular, the word empowerment comes to mind when we're trying to just like share that power with people at different nodes of a network. And another term that we like to think of in indie hall terms anyway, is granting people agency to be operators within a system. Yep. To say like the rules of the game, you understand the rules, now you get to play the game. And that means you also maybe get to help adapt the rules as we go forward.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think you can see this in certain types of organizations and in certain types of businesses as well. So I think some of the best run franchise businesses kind of have this, where you have a core element, right? Like a core set of values and a core brand and a core idea about the product and what it should be. But then individual franchise owners are really allowed to take that and implement it and find what works best for their communities and areas. And then there's another element where you kind of gather people together, who are kind of centered around this core set of values, and share and propagate those ideas. So you allow those ideas to spring up, but then you also like allow them to kind of cross-pollinate. I think a lot of communities do this as well, successfully. So I think of some kind of church communities do this in a large way, where there's maybe a central religious body or something like that, but each church, in its own community, is allowed to operate and work independently, but they share that core value of whatever their religious belief is or something like that. So I think we can see examples of this throughout history in business and in communities more generally speaking. They seem to be effective. So anything to add there to that?
Yeah, I mean, I just came back from a conference. I mentioned I was in Portland. I was at this event called the World Domination Summit, which is kind of a tongue deeply planted in cheek name for a really interesting, great event that Chris Guillebeau, who's an author and a writer, and a bunch of his team throws. And one of the things that I left the event with being really inspired is how they kind of marry a 2-day main stage show with tools and intentions and core values and communication that doesn't just allow but strongly encourages attendees to self-organize meetups and events and things like that. And what was really cool about it was it allowed for, it almost takes away the opportunity for you to complain about the event. Because if there's something, if you can't find what you want going on, you have the ability to create it.
Yeah.
And because of that, you end up with this like really rich, diverse collection of things to do, including to take a break and just kind of like wander around Portland with people. So like and that's at the scale of thousands of people, temporarily only over a few days, although they do have a continuing organizing. This is their 8th year of the conference. So it's neat to see this applied to an in real life an event in this particular case too.
Yeah. Very cool. So it sounds a lot. So it's I think a good time to transition to the next part of the discussion, because it sounds like we speak the same language here. We seem to be on the same page about a lot of these ideas. And so these ideas are a lot of what gets me excited about cryptocurrencies and about blockchain more generally. But I know that you are a little bit more skeptical about the technology. At least that was kind of what the impression I got from some of the emails that we shared. So I was just hoping maybe you could unpack a little bit more why you consider yourself a little bit more of a skeptic, and maybe I can convert you here into why this stuff I think is going to be important.
So, I mean, I think a lot of my skepticism is rooted in this, the intertwining of blockchain and cryptocurrency. And I kind of understand how they're connected. The arc of cryptocurrency has been one that is, well, it's interesting to watch. Reminds me of lots of things that in the business world and things like, it reminds me of reactive markets, and generally things that I personally try to stay very far away from. I have a question about value and how I understand the idea of a technology architecture that allows you to essentially create scarcity, but I think scarcity and value are intertwined in a way here that doesn't totally, I don't think totally fit the realities of the economy that we live in. So that leads me to a second skepticism, which is when we are talking about cryptocurrency, and me being both a person who lives in the same world as you and I think everyone else watching this, but I'm also a business person, and the fluidity of capital is part of the tool that is money, right? I know that money and capital are also two distinctly different things, and so there's some interesting challenges in here. To put it in concrete terms, like I have a friend who is a crypto enthusiast. He actually does a bunch of media for one of the I can't remember which group in particular, but he had originally asked, like, hey, does Indie Hall accept crypto if I want to join? And I was like, no, we just take good old U.S. American dollars. And I said, for the sake of conversation, if I wanted to, what would that require? And so I got a basic understanding of, you set up a wallet, you get your QR code, and that's really all I have to do in order to accept Bitcoin. And that makes it sound very easy. But then I asked, well, what about when I want that money so I can put it towards paying for things that don't accept Bitcoin, that we need to run Indy Hall or whatever it is. And the steps for that were very complicated, but that's just early stage technology, so I don't worry too much about that. Right. The second part was what I made me scratch my head, which was, I've essentially gotten the same kind of answer a bunch of times, which is, well, just accept that Bitcoin now and leave it in a wallet and pretend it's not there, and just let it grow. And I'm like, no, that's not how business works. I mean, to a degree it is, but like that's not an answer to the question. And that having a really hard time getting a real answer to where Bitcoin fits into the cash flow of my life and my business has been difficult. The second part is the most interesting part of blockchain to me, from what I've seen, that has nothing or very little to do, I should say less to do, with the crypto, are things like smart contracts. And that actually is fascinating to me. However, I haven't found a good example, I haven't been shown a good example of something along the lines of smart contracts that is not also tied to cryptocurrency. Sure. So I think a lot of it comes down to the deep intertwining between those two things. I really want to understand how blockchain fits in the world, even if and when cryptocurrency is no longer a part of the equation. So what does this tool allow us to do besides exchange a currency? Or, like I said, even if we get to a point where the currency was flowing freely, it seems like the power here may not be the currency. And that's kind of what I'm coming to this hoping to learn.
Cool, yeah, so these are great, a lot of great points that you made, a lot of things that you brought up. So I'll try to take a few of them in turn and then kind of finish off with that last question, because I think that's a really interesting point, which is how are these two things intertwined? You know, how do we, you know, disintegrate those two things? So the first thing that I'll say, you kind of touched on like a little bit of the skepticism coming from this feeling like another one of, I think basically it could be described as sounding like another one of these hype things that people kind of push, you know, buzzwords for lack of a better word. Blockchain has kind of become a buzzword. You tack a blockchain onto the end of your startup name and your valuation doubles or whatever. And I totally get that. In fact, I kind of find that just as frustrating as you do. And you know, you see this with things like AI and you know, a bunch of other stuff, machine learning, all this different kind of things, right? And I think each of these different technologies has some promise some core promise that's really there. And then, like you said, there's a huge amount of hype that builds up around it, right? The thing that I'll say about blockchain and cryptocurrency is it truly is a technology. If you look before this last year, basically, where this hype has grown up, it really is a technology that kind of is a bottom-up thing. It really was developed in kind of the far-flung corners of the internet by people who care about things like decentralization and develop these things and have been working and talking about these things for a decade, or actually more than a decade. I mean, Bitcoin is now 10 years old, roughly, since that network launched. But there are people talking about how cryptography could enable more autonomy and decentralization for a whole decade before that, and doing a lot of the research and discussion that led to the development of Bitcoin. So the only point there is to just don't let this wave of hype that we're going through, you know, we're kind of, I think, cresting at this point, you know, and we'll kind of fall back down the other end of that into maybe the trial of disillusionment, as they call it, you know, where people will, you know, look at it as a joke technology, and then one day we'll see the actual use cases starting to emerge. And so that's a good way to transition to the next part, which you kind of touched on, like in terms of how do you accept it, how do you spend it, those kinds of things. I mean, some of those things are difficult, more difficult than they need to be right now. And I think a lot of that just has to do with kind of the technology advancing. We have, you know, there are a lot of things around scaling that have to be worked out and developed, really big problems, but a lot of really smart people are working on them. So I'm confident over time we're going to figure these things out. And the UX needs to be better. We need to have solutions to some of these problems to make things more approachable for kind of the average person to kind of use and spend on a day-to-day basis. And right now, I think, you know, that whole hold mentality, like just accept the Bitcoin and then forget about it, right? And then, you know, and let it grow. I think that's because we're very much in a speculative bubble right now, at least a speculative stage,
Right.
where I think a lot of people see the potential for this technology, but it's not there yet. And so a lot of people are kind of hoarding it and holding it and hoping that it'll be worth a lot more one day. And I think there's one use case there, which is the idea of store of value, right? Which is fine. But I think if this is really going to be as revolutionary as we think it is, then we're going to have to move beyond this idea of it's nothing but like a speculative store of value. And I think that will just take time and adoption, right? So I think that's I think that's kind of a sign of the times as opposed to the long-term applicability of the technology. So then the last thing I'll touch on is how you mentioned the thing that you find interesting is smart contracts. And then you mentioned, and I totally get that because I'm a developer, I know you're a developer, right? And so, that's where I look at it and I say, this is super interesting. I also look at it and I say, how does that intertwine? How do we get smart contracts working? Do we need cryptocurrencies to enable those? So the kind of short answer there is that I think smart contracts and a lot of these decentralized possibilities, the reason why we need, so to speak, cryptocurrency along with that is because we need an incentive structure that enables the decentralization. So you've probably heard of the idea of mining cryptocurrency, and you've heard of the idea of proof of stake. Maybe you've heard as an alternative to mining, which maybe is more environmentally friendly. And there are questions about whether it can be done in a decentralized manner. So that's a whole nother discussion. But the kind of short answer that I'm getting at is that if we want people to run nodes, secure the network by mining, do these things that allow it to be decentralized and permissionless and not controlled by any one entity, we need some incentive to enable them to do that. So that's where the cryptocurrency comes in. But just because we have a cryptocurrency on the network, and because that enables payments, and because it enables the incentives for the network to be decentralized, doesn't mean that the network can't be used for a whole bunch of other things beyond just the sending and receiving of value. And so that's where I start to look at some of the potential here, going back to some of the values that we were discussing before around why decentralization is important, right? So right now, a lot of times when you're doing this community building, especially in an online setting, you have no choice but to rely on a whole bunch of centralized service providers who in a lot of ways hold the keys to your community, right? You have a huge amount of online community right now happens in, for example, Facebook groups, right? Maybe in the tech circles that we run, that's not as common, but huge communities exist in these Facebook groups, local communities for neighborhoods and stuff like that. And it's all being done on this centralized platform that has its own agenda, its own incentives, right? And we just have to rely on those to build our communities. Even simple things like allowing a community to, for example, vote and to determine certain decisions within that community, right? If you want to do something like that, you're basically relying on some kind of centralized service to provide those things for you. And where I see a lot of potential with smart contracts and with these networks in general, with these permissionless public blockchain networks, is the ability to build decentralized versions and not one-to-one clones. I'm not saying we're just going to get Facebook on the blockchain or something naive like that, but basically to build tools that allow communities to flourish on top of these decentralized platforms that can't be censored or controlled or just exist at the whims of one independent company. So that's kind of where I see the most exciting potential. I'll let you react to that, Alex. What do you think? Is that convincing in any way, or how do you feel about it?
I mean, I'm a huge supporter of owning your platform, right? And whatever that is. I mean, at this point, building community on things like Facebook works really well because Facebook has done a really good job of making it relatively frictionless.
Yeah.
However, I'm active in a lot of groups, sort of like meta communities of community builders, and people have a lot of frustrations with Facebook. Right. Really the only thing keeping people there is how frictionless it is. I should say the frictionlessness makes it relatively effortless to get people not just on it, but coming back, because it's a place that people already are.
Yep.
The comparison, there are lots of I should not say lots of, there are a growing number of good alternatives that you can choose between either owning the platform, as in, downloading, installing on a self-hosted server, or at the very least paying a monthly or annual fee to license a tool. And for the people, especially people who, the Venn diagram of community builders and people that want to operate and manage technology, that overlap is very, very small.
Right.
I think you and I are a large percentage of it.
Right.
And so the reality is, I mean, you mentioned earlier, like UX is a big part of the challenge. I think that's going to be a big part of the challenge, but also I don't think decentralization. So here's the thing: is like people will follow the path of least resistance. And so it's not just about the UX, but it's also like where people already are. So I think where I'm still skeptical of, of tools that we already have being built on blockchain, and therefore somebody saying, well, nobody else holds the keys to my kingdom, and therefore that's better. Until people feel an extraordinary amount of pain over having not been holding the keys, I don't think people will be attracted to that. And truthfully, we're already seeing people be pissed off like royally at Facebook for things like Cambridge Analytica and manipulating feeds and all kinds of things, and people still go back to it. So I mean, personally, I'm curious at like what is people's breaking point and threshold where they go, okay, we can't have centralized power. I need something else. I don't think the vast majority, I don't even think a sizable minority of people are there enough for something like a social network. What would be interesting to me, I think the potential for emergence of a new way of communicating. Maybe it doesn't look anything like a social network we think of. Even just having this conversation, it kind of reminds me of the first time I used Git after using Subversion for a long time. And I'm sure this comparison is made often. And Git, it was faster. It was hard. It was harder to learn. It was harder to use.
Yes.
People built better tools, better UX on top of it. The advantages were that it was faster. It was more powerful. And you had your local repo that synced up with all your remotes and things like that. I also can't help but remind myself that one of the things that helped massively grow the Git stronghold was the introduction of GitHub.
Yeah.
To something that's re-centralized in otherwise decentralized technology. And granted, it didn't centralize Git, but people still needed a place to go, a place that they felt like they could trust. And I personally have a hard time trusting in a technology that itself doesn't have a track record, and that by virtue of what it is and how it can be forked and all kinds of other things, could in theory even turn on a dime, because it's tough. You can't have expectations of it, for better or for worse, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, those are actually all really, really good points. So your point around Git is very well made, and it's a great argument. And I would say that if I am skeptical about kind of the future of decentralization, or if I'm worried about it, it's in a similar kind of vein or similar thread, which is just because, and I actually wrote a blog post about this on Build Blockchain Tech recently, but just because you build a decentralized protocol doesn't guarantee that kind of the end steady state that you end up with is a decentralized world. I mean, the internet itself is a decentralized protocol, and yet we've seen with the rise of things like Google and Facebook and some other companies to a lesser extent, we've re-centralized in a small handful of platforms. And Git and GitHub are another great example of that. So I think one thing that we really risk here is that, yes, we decentralize certain things, but we end up creating new kind of choke points, and we re-centralize around those new choke points in the future. And it may we end up in a worse place than we were to begin with. So I think that is an extremely valid point, Alex, and definitely one to be kind of considerate of, and frankly just watchful of, like kind of on the lookout for. So those of us who care about decentralization and think that this blockchain technology can help us build a more kind of bottom-up kind of world should be on the lookout for these new choke points and how we might re-centralize. I think that's a great point, very well made. I also think the point that you made around, people are already on these networks, right? And so how do we get them from something that they may not love, they may even be really pissed off at, right, because of these data leaks and all that stuff, but they're there and it's very friction-free, and Facebook makes it its business to be friction-free. So I agree with you there as well, to a large extent. I don't think we're just going to naively port existing things like social networks over onto the blockchain and have it work, right? What excites me, though, is that we're building a new set of primitives, right? Decentralized file storage, decentralized compute, smart contracts that can make things truly immutable and trustless, so that even if I'm creating a service, you don't have to trust me to not change my mind about the rules of that service, right? You think about creators on YouTube and stuff, the way that they're paid out, how the rules just change out from under them overnight, all these different things where people spend time building a community on a centralized service and then have the rules changed on them, right? If you can encode those rules in a smart contract, not even you, the creator of the service, will be able to change those rules in the future, right? So we're creating this new set of primitives that the next generation of things that are going to be important can be built on. And hopefully this next time around, it'll be a little different. Whether we're going to topple these existing platforms, I don't think so, certainly not in the short term, but at least we have an option, a different option moving forward.
I also think about, I think about areas that the first time around were massively revolutionary for, especially in the context of trust, right? So like, I don't think eBay pioneered online reviews, but they absolutely popularized them. And the idea, like pre-reviews and a review rating system, the idea of buying things from a stranger on the internet was completely insane. And the introduction of reviews made that suddenly way less crazy to send money to a stranger and expect that you'd actually get the thing that you paid for. And reviews now have a pretty major problem at scale, especially in places like Amazon. I was just listening to, I think it was a Planet Money podcast about a guy who created a technology that basically scrapes online reviews, does a bunch of analysis on them, and then does a recalibrated rating, like star rating for Amazon, to say, we threw out all the ratings that we think are bogus. Here's the ones you can actually trust. And and thinking about, like, if one of the architectural benefits of blockchain is trust, and I think maybe that's the thing to lean into, and maybe I need to understand it a little bit more. But like, if smart contracts are the most interesting thing to me, the idea, it seems underneath, is that the technology itself can't create trust between two people, but it creates an architecture where that trust can be established in a way that did not exist previously, in the same way that prior to ratings and reviews, it did not exist previously. And I don't know what that is yet, and maybe you know of examples, but knowing how big of a problem online reviews are right now, for massive companies. So even these massive companies have an economic incentive to embrace tools and technology that allow their ratings and reviews, which in many cases are like the key to their success economically. Is there potential for things, or have you seen things like blockchain being applied to something that as specific as ratings and reviews?
Yeah, so I think the real, like, what you're kind of getting at here is this idea of trust minimization, right? Where I can establish a relationship with another entity via these networks without having to inherently trust them, because the networks are going to enforce some rules that are encoded in, for example, a smart contract for me, and I can trust that the network is going to do that. And so maybe I can interact with someone who I don't have an inherent trust of, but it's possible for us to interact trustlessly because the network provides that layer, so to speak. How would you apply that specifically to something like ratings and reviews? Well, for one thing, I mean, I'm just riffing off the top of my head here. For one thing, the data is immutable and auditable, right? So it's not sitting in somebody's database somewhere that they can modify at will, right? And so any review that was submitted by any entity on the blockchain would be very clear who submitted that, how they submitted it, what their history of submitting reviews was, right? So you can also do things with blockchain like more spam, guard against spam, right? Like if every time you post a review, you have to pay a very, very small fee, like a fraction of a penny or something to post that review, you can, that isn't a big deal for an average user. Maybe the software they're using would just do it automatically. But some spammer who is trying to create a false sense of a review, it doesn't work at scale, right? So that's another application. And then the idea also of like a crude reputation, again, because you have a unique identity that at the simplest level can just be your private public key pair, right? Like no one can falsify that identity, right? If I'm posting as me, as validated by my private key, no one can falsify that. So you can see my full history. You can trust completely that it's me or some entity that's doing the posting. And reputation can accrue to certain entities who do high quality reviews. Some mechanism can be coded to accrue that reputation so that their reviews can be weighted higher or lower. So again, just totally riffing on the specific thing that you mentioned, but I do think there are lots of areas like this where you can start to apply these primitives, these decentralized, trust-free primitives to problems and build systems that are more robust to the kind of issues that you were pointing out.
Thinking about the way you just described that, I think it strikes me as the kind of thing that would allow for portable reputation. Portable reputation is difficult without a decentralized technology because a company doesn't want their competitor to have you bringing your reputation over to their system. But
or your network or your audience, right?
Right. So the idea of a truly portable, I'm thinking about the dystopian implications of that as well. The Black Mirror had the episode Nosedive, and Cory Doctorow wrote about this in Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom like 20 years ago or whatever. So obviously there's things to be considered in all of these things. I guess China is working on some sort of reputation system as well. That's probably the complete opposite, where it's like massively centralized and owned by the government. So if you're going to go that direction, it would be interesting to see something like a blockchain implementing it. I had another thought, and I think maybe it was also related to.
Well,
I was thinking back to another like decentralized primitive that the first people to get it right were the ones who won. So I was involved in the community that built OpenID, and getting to watch that develop. I maybe if I was paying more attention to the development process of blockchain, I hunch I would see some similarities. Obviously, OpenID didn't have the economic incentives built in, but it was also very interesting to watch Facebook come in and implement what OpenID was trying to do better than OpenID ever did. And part of that was its own ubiquity, its really good UX. And so I think that's a thing to as all the blockchain versions of this are being developed is it doesn't strike me as outside of the realm of possibility that really great tools are built on the blockchain, and then a centralized entity comes along and goes, that's a really good idea, yoink, and then they build the commercial centralized version because they have the capital to do so. It becomes so I can see, and truthfully, like that's kind of the cycle of the internet. So I think you made a point earlier that I think is maybe the most interesting thing out of this conversation for me, which is by developing these new primitives, we have the ability to create new interactions that were not possible before, and whether they live on the blockchain forever may not even, like the blockchain is sort of this sort of opportunity of a stepping stone to think in a new way and to design in a new way. That makes it pretty interesting.
And so that's true. So one thing that I'll mention there, which I think something you touched on, the OpenID versus, that's pretty cool that you were involved in that, by the way, I didn't know that, but the OpenID versus the Facebook ID and how the centralized service was able to come along. So that's another kind of point, going back to this idea of why do we really need cryptocurrency and how does that play into blockchain? The truth is that incentives are really powerful, right? And people respond to incentives. So the people creating OpenID had like a motivation from wanting to create this decentralized ID platform, identification platform, but Facebook had a really huge financial incentive to create one and to win that battle, right? And so they were willing to spend a lot of money and effort. And there was just no way for a decentralized service to kind of embed any sort of incentives, to have the incentives itself, other than kind of just goodwill and a kind of desire for the world to be a certain way, right? And so ultimately the cold-hearted capitalist incentives for Facebook ended up winning out, and they kind of own that identity platform now. And what's interesting about cryptocurrency on blockchains is that they allow you to push those incentives out to the edges rather than in some centralized service, right? So individual users can be, in different ways, incented to participate in the system and to get others involved in the system, right? So it's not saying that incentives don't matter. It's saying, well, we need incentives. I'd rather push those incentives out to the edges of the system to allow the system to remain decentralized as opposed to just in some central authority. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to build networks and to build systems and to allow, it's also kind of just more, I don't know, to use a potentially loaded word, a little more just, I think, right? Like the early users of a given service create an enormous amount of value for that service, but none of that value accrues to them. It accrues to the creator of the service, right? And so maybe it's actually a little more fair in a sense for if you're an early adopter or early evangelist of a given service, that you would have some of that value accrue to you if the service does take off. So just an interesting take on how incentives can be different with blockchain networks that have cryptocurrencies built into them. And then the last thing that I'll maybe mention, and then maybe we can kind of wrap up, is you made another great point, which is you started to think about a distributed, decentralized reputation system, and then you started to think about the kind of dystopian applications of that as well. And I think the parallel between blockchain and the internet is made a lot, and I think with the internet we all kind of like rushed in excitedly, and we built this thing. And maybe only just now, even in just the last few years, we're starting to realize like, there are some side effects of this that we didn't really consider carefully enough, some things that we would have liked to have done differently now that we have about hindsight. And I think maybe it would be wise of us this time around, if blockchain and crypto is going to be another kind of wave of innovation in a similar vein, to maybe try to think a few steps ahead and to try to head off at the pass.
At least actually be honest about what lessons we've learned and whether or not we've learned them.
Yeah, exactly. Great point.
Do you see a and obviously I'm asking you to make a prediction here, but we're talking about cryptocurrency. We had that wave near the end of last year where people are going home to have Christmas or Thanksgiving dinner with their families, and grandma's asking about what is this Bitcoin? Do you do the Bitcoin? And that felt like the beginning of a mainstream moment, and going into places and seeing a Bitcoin ATM or things like that. What are some of the things that are either necessary, being worked on, or both, for Bitcoin to break out of this speculative market and into an actual financial tool? I guess is one of my remaining questions, because it feels still deeply seated in speculative market, conceptual. But if people truly believe it's going to go there, what are the things that need to happen, and are those things actually being done?
Yeah, great question. So I think you're absolutely right. I think we're very much in those early days, that kind of speculative. We went through kind of a phase of speculative mania. Like I said, I think we're kind of coming off the end of that now. But so yeah, there's a whole bunch of work that needs to be done, and I think that that's the phase that we're at. Frankly, if we're honest with ourselves, we're at the phase of kind of building the infrastructure, the base levels, the primitives that need to be created. One of the big things, the big obvious thing that needs to be tackled, is the idea of scaling, right? So right now, Bitcoin can only handle like 3 to 7 transactions per second. Networks like Ethereum can handle maybe an order of magnitude more. But when you compare that to kind of the global, if these are supposed to be global platforms, not only for commerce, but also for smart contracts and executing all these interactions on the blockchain, that's not even close to cutting it, right? So scaling is something that has to be figured out. And there are a ton of very smart people working on that and coming at the problem at a whole bunch of different angles. So you have what are called layer 1 or on-chain scaling solutions being worked on, I think most credibly by folks in Ethereum. So things like proof of stake, things like sharding of the blockchain, so similar to sharding a database, which I know you're probably familiar with, Alex. So people working on things like that. And then there are what's called layer 2 solutions, where they look at the base blockchain as really just the initial base protocol, almost like TCP/IP, and then you need to build something on top like HTTP or whatever, right? And so those solutions are things like Lightning, the Lightning Network on Bitcoin, which was deployed and is kind of in a beta stage right now after years of development. And so we're starting to see some promise and some development there. So I think scaling is definitely one of the big things. I think the other thing, we kind of touched on this earlier, was things like UX and approachability, right? So asking the average user to memorize or store a seed phrase of 12 keys and never ever lose it, and if they lose it, their entire online identity is gone forever and they lose all their money, like that's obviously unacceptable.
It's not going to work.
Right, exactly. So so some better solutions around those kinds of things, how custody works, how key management works, is another big one, I think. And I think, again, there are smart people thinking about and working on these things. So I'm fairly confident that we'll see those solutions evolve. It may not be on the time frames that some of us want, right, or expect, right? It may be more, I'm frankly looking at things more on the like 5 to 10 year kind of time horizon, as opposed to the 1 to 2 year time horizon for this stuff. I think in that 1 to 2 year, we'll see a lot of exciting developments, but they're going to be these low level infrastructure kind of things, not these things that cause it to really go mainstream. Now, one thing we might see is more adoption from the financial sector at looking at cryptocurrencies as an asset class in which they want to invest in and hold. And that's kind of just like a leveling up of this idea of it as a speculative store of value, right? It's going from normal folks holding it. I think we may see it level up to bigger institutions, pension funds, and folks like, big time investors on Wall Street investing and holding into it. And so that may cause the price to go up a lot, which is fine. That'll be nice. But I think the thing that really excites me is the stuff that we've been talking about, the decentralization and the more mainstream adoption. And I think that we're just a number of years away from that, frankly, at this point.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, this has been a really great combo. We ended up going way over time. So I'm going to just encourage any of the folks who have been following along at home to, if you want to get in contact with us, shoot me and or Alex an email. I think that would be an awesome way to continue the conversation, or tag me on Twitter. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know on the East Coast we're getting ready for lunch over here. But Alex, is there anything else that you wanted to mention, any projects or places where folks can get in contact with you before we wrap up?
No, I mean, the stuff that you mentioned in the slides earlier is a great way to get a hold of me. Always welcome an email or shoot me a tweet and say, hey.
All right.
Or come and visit us at Indie Hall.
Sounds good. Well, thanks again, Alex, for all of your time, and happy 4th of July to those of us in the States tomorrow. And have a good one.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben.
Bye.